Yeah, I just thought she was so cute. I said to myself, I'm going to go up there. With those spontaneous words, a teenager named Bob Clayton launched himself into the history of American Bandstand. What began as a simple crush on a girl he saw dancing on television quickly transformed into one of the most iconic partnerships in the show's golden years. Bob's story is not just about a boy who made it onto national television. It's about the magnetic energy of a generation discovering itself through music, rhythm, and television screens. In the late 1950s, when millions of teens rushed home after school to tune into Bandstand, Bob was there, dancing with the girl who had captivated his heart, Justine Carrelli. Together they became America's sweethearts, their steps and smiles etched into the memories of a nation. And yet, if Justine's name still echoes in the nostalgia of Bandstand fans, Bob's often drifts like a fading note. He was once adored, a teen idol whose mailbox overflowed with cufflinks sent by admirers. But in later years, he chose a quieter path, a family man, a salesman, a man who found contentment far from the spotlight. This is the story of Bob Clayton, the teenager who declared his intentions with a cocky grin, the dancer who twirled his way into millions of living rooms, and the man who slipped gracefully into a life of simplicity. His journey reveals not only the fleeting nature of fame, but the deeper meaning of what it means to be remembered. Bob Clayton was born on December 29, 1940, at a time when America was entering a new era. The war years were fading into memory, and a spirit of optimism defined the post-war generation. For young Bob, this meant growing up in Delaware, in a country where prosperity was rising and teenage culture was beginning to emerge as a force of its own. Unlike the dazzling image that would later appear on television, Bob's early years were grounded in the simplicity of mid-century American life. He went to school, worked small jobs, and spent afternoons listening to the radio when rock and roll first exploded onto the airwaves. The glow of family radios and neighborhood jukeboxes offered the soundtrack to his boyhood, filling his imagination with rhythm long before cameras ever found him. At DuPont High School, from which he graduated in 1958, Bob stood out for his good looks and easy charm. With blonde hair, a ready smile, and a polite manner, he seemed both approachable and quietly confident. Friends remembered him not as someone seeking attention, but as someone who could make you feel at ease. It was this warmth, combined with his natural rhythm on the dance floor, that hinted at a special path ahead. Yet, at heart, he was a boy shaped by family and community. Those close to him described him as respectful, dependable, and deeply tied to the values of home. While television would later broadcast his confident style to millions, his grounding came from the quiet strength of those early years. The family dinners, the close-knit neighborhoods, the responsibility instilled by parents who expected him to work hard and stay true. There was also a streak of determination in him. Bob wasn't one to dream idly. When he set his mind to something, he pursued it. That trait would soon become evident when, as a teenager, he spotted a girl dancing on television and decided she would not just remain an image on a screen. He would meet her, dance with her, and change both their lives. In the ordinary rhythms of his childhood, school days, radio nights, and neighborhood games, there was little to suggest that Bob Clayton would one day be known as one half of America's most beloved dancing duo. But those ordinary roots gave him both the humility and the drive to step into something extraordinary. That life-changing moment came not in a classroom or a neighborhood hall, but in front of a flickering television screen. Bob was about to transform from a Delaware schoolboy into a national figure whose steps would be watched by millions. The leap from living room viewer to television dancer was, for Bob Clayton, a story of both boldness and destiny. Like countless other teenagers, he tuned in to American Bandstand after school, drawn to the music, the movement, and the promise that the show held for young America. But while most kids were content to watch, Bob made a decision that would define his youth. He would not just watch, he would be part of it. The spark came the day he first saw Justine Carrelli on screen. Graceful, poised, and already becoming a favorite with the home audience, she seemed unattainable to most, but not to Bob. I just thought she was so cute. I said to myself, I'm going to go up there. It was a teenager's confident vow, equal parts innocence and audacity. And unlike so many youthful promises, Bob followed through. Arriving at Studio B in Philadelphia, Bob found himself among throngs of eager teens hoping to step into the glow of the cameras. The atmosphere pulsed with anticipation. Music spilled from inside, blending with the chatter of teenagers dressed in their best, hoping for a chance to be seen. For Bob, crossing that threshold was like entering a new world, one where ordinary kids became national figures overnight. Meeting Justine wasn't instantaneous magic. She already had a boyfriend and at first brushed him off, but Bob's persistence matched his charm. He danced with one of her friends, then came back at the end of the night with a playful challenge. "Are you going to dance with me or what?" That mixture of confidence and humor broke through. They danced together, and something clicked immediately. Bob later teased that he told Justine, "You're going to be my girlfriend." She remembered his swagger, calling him real cocky, but admitted, "It was like I had danced with him forever." In that moment, a partnership was born, one that would soon become the heart of American Bandstand. When Bob stepped in front of the cameras with Justine for the first time, the audience watching at home saw something special. The music began, and two teenagers moved in sync as though they had always been paired. What started as a daring decision in a Delaware living room had transformed into a moment of national television history. For Bob Clayton, that first dance was more than a triumph. It was the opening chapter of a journey that would carry him into the hearts of millions. From now on, he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was the boy who had dared to chase the girl on the screen, and together they would become unforgettable. It didn't take long for the magic between Bob Clayton and Justine Carrelli to become the centerpiece of American Bandstand. Viewers who tuned in after school quickly recognized that there was something different about this pair. The way they moved together seemed effortless, as though they had been partners for years rather than weeks. Their steps were crisp, their chemistry undeniable, and their smiles felt as genuine as the music itself. One of the most memorable moments came when they entered a bandstand dance contest. With cameras rolling and the studio crowd cheering, Bob and Justine danced with the kind of synchronicity that made the floor seem like it belonged only to them. When the music ended, they were crowned winners, and each received a prize that perfectly symbolized the era, a full-size jukebox. That image, the two teenagers smiling broadly with their jukeboxes, became an enduring snapshot of their bandstand years. Bob's personal style added to his appeal. He loved the jitterbug, a dance filled with spins, kicks, and lighthearted energy, but he was equally adept at slower numbers. He later recalled, with a mischievous grin, that during those dances he would hold Justine close and kiss her on the neck. It was a detail that never made it onto the broadcast, but it captured the playful intimacy that made their partnership so compelling. Justine agreed. "The jitterbug was probably my favorite. We had a blast." The impact on fans was immediate and intense. Letters flooded into the studio. During one broadcast, host Dick Clark asked Bob what he collected, and he mentioned cufflinks. Within weeks, packages began arriving from across the country, each one containing cufflinks from fans who wanted to share a piece of themselves with their television idol. Justine received her own tokens of affection, most memorably hundreds of dolls after she admitted she liked them. Together, the gifts reflected just how invested the audience had become in their lives. Magazines and newspapers quickly caught on. Photos of Bob and Justine appeared in teen publications, often accompanied by captions calling them America's sweethearts. They were more than just dancers on television. They were role models, style icons, and symbols of what teenage romance was supposed to look like. Across the country, teenagers imitated their hairstyles, their clothes, and even the way they held each other on the dance floor. Bob himself seemed to carry fame lightly. He wasn't a singer nor an actor. He was just a boy who danced well, smiled easily, and had the courage to step forward. But in that simplicity lay his charm. To teenagers sitting at home, he was relatable. He wasn't distant like Hollywood stars. He was someone they could imagine knowing, maybe even dating, if they lived just a little closer to Philadelphia. In a decade when television was still shaping American culture, Bob Clayton became one of its most visible teenage faces. For a few years, he and Justine defined the look and feel of what it meant to be young in the 1950s. Their dances were not just entertainment, they were rituals of a generation coming of age in a new post-war America. And yet, Behind all the glitter and cheers, life was beginning to test them in ways that cameras could not capture. Because even for America's sweethearts, perfection on screen did not always translate into perfection off it. By the late 1950s, Bob Clayton and Justine Carrelli had become inseparable in the public eye. To the millions of teenagers who tuned into American Bandstand, they were not just two kids from Philadelphia and Delaware. They were the couple, the dream pairing that embodied young love, excitement, and the thrill of rock and roll. To watch them dance was to believe in possibility, in innocence, and in joy. Their nickname, America's Sweethearts, was no exaggeration. Fan clubs dedicated to the couple sprang up in cities far beyond the East Coast. Teen magazines placed their photos alongside rising singers, treating them with the same level of attention usually reserved for pop idols. Letters from fans poured into the studio, addressed not to the show or to Dick Clark, but directly to Bob and Justine. The connection between the couple and their audience was personal, almost intimate, as though millions of young viewers had adopted them as their own friends. Behind the cameras, however, there was a different kind of reality. Bandstand was more than just a dance floor. It was a production with strict rules. Couples were expected to keep a wholesome image, avoid any gestures considered too forward, and always maintain the polished appearance of respectable teenagers. Competition was fierce, too. With dozens of eager kids hoping to get airtime, jealousy simmered. Other dancers sometimes whispered that Bob and Justine were favored, that their popularity ensured more camera shots. While these comments occasionally stung, the pair kept their focus on what they did best, dancing with authenticity and joy. There were moments of humor, the kind that never reached the television audience. During one contest, Bob and Justine nearly stumbled mid-dance, but their recovery, a burst of laughter followed by a flawless spin, only made the crowd cheer louder. Visiting guest stars, musicians who would later become legends, sometimes joked that the dancers were stealing attention from them. For Bob, these were the moments that made Bandstand feel less like a show and more like a family gathering filled with inside jokes and shared triumphs. Their greatest highlight, perhaps, was the dance contest where they each won a jukebox. To teenage America, a jukebox was the ultimate symbol of the era: freedom, music, and the power to choose the soundtrack of your life. Seeing Bob and Justine beam with pride as they stood beside their prizes was a moment etched into the collective memory of Bandstand fans. It wasn't just a victory, it was a coronation of sorts, confirming their place as icons of the dance floor. And yet, even within the glow of fame, there were pressures. Bob was growing older, navigating the same restless feelings as any young man. Justine was balancing the demands of the show with her own hopes and dreams. Behind the picture-perfect facade of America's Sweethearts, cracks were beginning to form, cracks that would soon turn into heartbreak. For millions of teenagers glued to their televisions, Bob Clayton and Justine Carrelli seemed untouchable. They were graceful, charming, and perfectly in sync, the kind of couple fans believed would last forever. But behind the curtain of American Bandstand, their story was less like a fairy tale and more like real life, full of insecurities, temptations, and the inevitable pains of growing up. Justine remembered it clearly, the moment she realized Bob's attention was drifting. Bob started to have a roaming eye. I was just heartbroken, she confessed years later. To the outside world, they were flawless. Inside, they were two young people discovering that affection and fame didn't always mix easily. Bob, for his part, admitted the truth with disarming honesty. "I guess I had sort of a roaming eye," he said, reflecting on their breakup. "We were outgrowing each other." For Justine, the end came with blunt finality. "I said, 'Hit the road, Jack,'" she recalled, half laughing, half remembering the sting. For the fans who idolized them, it was a shock. Letters arrived at the studio wondering why the golden couple no longer danced together. To see Bob and Justine separate was to witness the unraveling of a dream that had belonged not only to them, but to the entire teenage nation watching from their living rooms. At the same time, the pressures of Bandstand were intensifying. The show demanded presence, discipline, and an unyielding smile. For Bob, who had never aspired to be a professional performer, the grind was beginning to outweigh the joy. What had started as an impulsive leap into the spotlight was now a demanding role, one that left little room for a normal life. And so, Bob began to step back. His appearances became less frequent, his name slowly fading from the fan magazines and the spotlight he had once shared with Justine. By the early 1960s, the boy who had been one of television's most beloved dancers was quietly moving on. Justine carried on for a time, but even she would eventually leave the show, closing the chapter on an era that had defined them both. It was a bittersweet moment. Bob had known the rush of adoration, the thrill of being part of a cultural phenomenon, and the warmth of letters and gifts from fans across the country. But like so many teenage idols before and after him, he faced the truth. Fame is fleeting and life demands new choices. Stepping away from Bandstand was not a failure. It was a turning point, a decision to leave behind the demands of a television persona in order to discover who he might become off the dance floor. For the fans, it felt like loss. For Bob, it was the beginning of something else entirely, the life of a husband, a father, and a working man whose story would unfold far from the glow of studio lights. When Bob Clayton stepped away from the spotlight, he did so without hesitation or regret. Unlike some of his fellow Bandstand regulars who tried to stay tethered to the entertainment industry, Bob sought something steadier. He traded the cameras and stage lights for the world of work and family, and in doing so, built a life that reflected his true values. His first jobs were in retail, starting with Storm's Shoes and The Little Heel. Customers remembered him as the same kind of young man they had once seen on television, personable, polite, and quick with a smile. It didn't matter whether he was selling shoes or dancing the jitterbug, Bob had a way of making people feel at ease. Later, he shifted into wholesale and eventually joined Diamond Chemical and Supply Co., where he worked faithfully until his retirement in 1998. For decades, his rhythm was no longer set to music, but to the daily cadence of hard work and responsibility. In those years, Bob also found lasting love. He married Elizabeth Litzi Clayton, the woman who became his partner for more than 3 decades. Together they raised 3 children, Sherry, Christine, and Robert Wayne, Toby. To friends and neighbors in Wilmington, Delaware, Bob was not a celebrity, but a family man, present at school events, proud of his kids' achievements, and happiest in the role of husband and father. Later, his grandchildren, Brett and Taylor, brought him even greater joy, adding another layer of meaning to his life. That didn't mean he cut ties completely with the Bandstand community. In 1992, at the show's 40th reunion, Bob once again danced with Justine. As the music played, they moved as if no time had passed. "We danced, and it was like we had never stopped," Justine said later. For the audience watching, it was as though a cherished memory had sprung back to life, if only for a moment. Outside of those reunions, Bob lived quietly. He and Litzi enjoyed time on their boat, sunlit afternoons on the water, and the peace of a life far from the scrutiny of national television. Photographs from this period show him smiling easily, relaxed, and content. To those who remembered the boy who had once captivated millions, it might have seemed like an unexpected ending. But for Bob, it was exactly what he wanted. A life defined not by adoring crowds, but by love, stability, and laughter shared with family. On November 6, 2016, Bob passed away from congestive heart failure at the age of 75. The timing was poignant. It was the very day after the launch of Bandstand Memories, a book celebrating the program that had once defined his youth. Many fans had looked forward to seeing him there, not realizing how ill he had become. His absence was felt deeply, not only as a loss of a beloved Bandstand figure, but also as the quiet departure of a man who had chosen a different, humbler stage for his life. Bob Clayton's post-Bandstand years reveal a truth often hidden in stories of fame, that happiness is not always found in staying under the lights, but sometimes in walking away from them. For Bob, the applause had faded, but love and family endured. Bob Clayton's life was a reminder that stardom can shine brightly and fade quietly, yet still leave an imprint on the hearts of those who witnessed it. On American Bandstand, he was the confident blonde teenager who dared to step onto the dance floor with Justine Carrelli, creating a partnership so natural it became the symbol of young love in the 1950s. Off-screen, he built a different kind of legacy, one of family, steady work, and a quiet devotion to the people who mattered most. For some, Bob will always be the boy who twirled through the jitterbug with effortless charm. For others, he is remembered as a kind husband, a proud father, and a grandfather whose greatest applause came not from a national audience, but from those seated around his dinner table. Both legacies are equally true, and together they form the picture of a life well lived. But perhaps what lingers most is the memory. The sight of Bob and Justine gliding across the bandstand floor, smiling as if the music belonged only to them, remains etched in the collective nostalgia of a generation. Do you still remember those afternoons, watching Bob and Justine dance across your black and white screen? Which song, which moment still stays with you today? If these memories touched your heart, stay with us here on American Bandstand Memories. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next story of the dancers, the music, and the era that shaped a generation.